the Trump administration just dropped its national security strategy. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that I'm still digesting it. There is a very clear message from the strategy that was issued that the United States is taking a very big turn away from the kind of alliances that have been the hallmark of our foreign policy, and I would argue our real strength in influencing events in the world. So if you look at it, there's a very strong indictment of Europe, and in particular, the openness of Europe and the composition of the population of Europe. And that, to me, is an unnecessary division between us and countries with whom we have a lot in common and a lot that is necessary to our security. The sort of updating of the Monroe Doctrine that goes back to a very early president of ours, James Monroe, about dominating the Western Hemisphere, is something that is going to be very difficult to pull off, and we're watching the administration with its buildup of military power and its use in the region, and wondering, where that will lead. But in general, it raises more questions than answers about what actually will be done to implement these kind of very broad statements that are found in the strategy.
So if a lot of that is in theory, let's just talk about what we've seen so far in the last 11 months. When you look around the world, what is your sense of the impact Trump has had on his second term on countries around the world?
Well, personally, I'm quite concerned about the impact because there has been a very heavy emphasis on moving away from what I think are core American values in a number of ways. And that's not to say that there haven't been some successes.
Can you describe those values? What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both in an affirmative way by very rarely criticizing Putin for the brutal war that he has waged on the Ukrainian people, and then, attempting to try to coerce the Ukrainians into accepting a negotiated ceasefire and peace deal that would be, by any objective measure, leaving them vulnerable to further Russian activity. Remember, Russia has been in Ukraine since 2014, so this didn't start in 2022. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be reviewed and looked at from the perspective of what are the long-term consequences. And I just find that very often it's difficult to wrap your arms around, what is the objective? If it is to cause disruption and hope that that will lead to a better outcome, I've seen a lot of disruption, but we're still not yet at the point where we see what the actual effects will be. So take a couple of quick things. I very quickly supported the 20-point peace plan to bring about the Gaza ceasefire, and gave the president and his people credit for getting that terrible war to finally end. But it's a 20-point peace plan that takes an enormous amount of work and effort and diplomacy and negotiation and carrots and sticks to make sure you get all the parties around the table and try to figure out how to move forward with it. That's where we'll really find out if that is going to stick. I already mentioned Ukraine. I think it's a terrible position for the United States to be in. I was thinking 35 years ago, another dictator invaded a neighbor, namely Saddam Hussein, crossed the border to seize parts of Kuwait. And the world rightly reacted, because you cannot reward that kind of aggression where efforts are made to literally invade your neighbor and seize territory, claiming that by some, theory it belongs to you. So the world reacted. Saddam Hussein was, obviously pushed back. In this situation, Putin is intent upon taking as much of Ukraine as he can. I think we could have played, both in the Biden administration and now in the Trump administration, a much more assertive role in trying to help Ukraine continue to do the very heroic job it's doing defending itself. With China, if you look at the national security strategy, there's a lot of, very important points about economic competition. And we also, though, have to recognize that along with the economic competition, there's a strategic competition with China in the region. And the buildup of the Chinese military assets are, ones that pose a direct threat. First, foremost to our allies in the region, but then also to the United States. So, when you look at diplomacy of any kind, whether it's trying to end a war or trying to prevent a war, or deter your adversaries, there has to be so much follow-up. And there is an aversion within the administration to, the kind of work that is done by foreign service officers, diplomats, others who are on the front lines trying to fulfill these national security objectives. And there's a very small group around the president who he trusts to do all of this. And I think in many ways that is just not adequate for the complexity of the problems we face.
But part of the criticism that the Trump administration has often had, say, for example, of the Obama administration or even the Biden administration, was that there was too much of all of that stuff. And so they claim that they right-sized the China strategy, which was a direct critique of the Obama years. And in a sense, there's bipartisan agreement in the United States. I'm not saying that's right, but there is. That we needed a different approach to China.
Look, I think that there's a lot to critique in any presidential administration. But I think that there's also a lot to learn from any presidential administration about what works and what doesn't work. For example, I recently saw an analysis of peace agreements, which ones actually stick and how you get to them. Obviously in the 90s, there was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, there was the Dayton Agreement in the Balkans. And so I know how much effort went into actually getting those agreements made. And in the case of Northern Ireland and in the case of the Balkans, what it took to demilitarize, decommission the weapons of the combatants, all of that, that is the boring, hard work of actually achieving diplomatic success. And I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of dramatic and bold action that we see from this president, but that standing alone is not sufficient. It may be necessary to get the world's attention, get the party's attention, get something done in the immediate effort to show progress, but then you've got to do all of that hard work. So it's not either or. When I think about the kinds of diplomacy that I saw, in the 90s, that I saw when I was in the Senate, that I was part of in the Obama administration, there are a lot of tools in the toolkit. And among those tools are soft power, development, which we have unfortunately decided is not going to be a prominent tool in how we try to influence people, persuade them. China's filling that gap, particularly in Africa. So to me, you don't get into office and say everything that was ever done going back to the founding of the country was wrong and we're going to do it differently. You say, hey, I've got a different style, I've got some different ideas, I'm going to learn from the past, I'm going to apply what works, and then we're going to go from there. That just makes sense to me, and I worry that we are, shutting a lot of doors, cutting off a lot of our allies, and not learning some of those lessons right now.